My grandson asked me a question last Thanksgiving that I wasn't ready for. He's 11. He still smells like outside when he comes in from playing, that mix of cold air and cut grass. And he just sat down next to me at the table and said, "Grandpa, how come you always look sad when we talk about your dad?" I'm 73 years old. I've buried friends. I've watched my career come and go. I've sat in doctors' offices and heard things I never wanted to hear. And an 11-year-old boy with grass stains on his knees is the one who finally cracked something open in me that I had been carrying around for over 50 years. I didn't have a good answer for him. I said something like, "I don't know, buddy." But that was a lie. I knew exactly why. I just had never admitted it out loud. Not to him, not to anyone. So I want to talk about something today that I think most of us over 50 have never fully faced. And that is this: the story you've been telling about your own life. The one that explains why things went the way they did, why you ended up where you are, why certain doors never opened for you. That story might be the most dangerous thing you own. Not because it's false. Parts of it are probably completely true. But because you've been using it as a place to live instead of a place to visit. I spent 31 years in a career I hated. 31. I went into insurance because my uncle said it was stable. And stable was the word my mother used like it was the highest possible compliment a life could earn. My father had left when I was 9. Just left. Came home one Tuesday in November, packed a bag, and was gone before I woke up the next morning. My mother was left with 3 kids and a house payment and a kind of quiet devastation she never fully recovered from. So when my uncle said insurance, stable, good pension, she nodded with this relief that I can still see on her face. And I chose it for her, for the look on her face, not for me. And for 31 years, I woke up every Monday with this low-grade dread that I just accepted as part of being an adult. I told myself everyone felt that way. I told myself the people who loved their work were either lying or lucky. I told myself the story that said, your father left, money is precarious, safety is the goal, and wanting more than safety is for people who didn't grow up the way you did. That story kept me safe, and it kept me small. And I didn't realize until I was 62 years old and sitting in an empty office after my last day at that company, looking at a little cake someone had bought from the grocery store, that I had spent the most productive years of my life being the main character in a story I hadn't consciously chosen. There's a researcher, Dr. Dan McAdams, a psychologist out of Northwestern. And he spent decades studying something called narrative identity. The idea that we are not just people with memories. We are the stories we construct from those memories. We decide which events matter. We decide who was the villain and who was the victim. And then we live inside that construction like it's the truth, like it's just the way things are, instead of recognizing it as the version of events we chose to emphasize. But before I get into the science of it, and I promise not to lose you here because this part actually matters, let me give you a simpler picture first. You know what a vinyl record sounds like when it gets scratched? That needle just keeps falling into the same groove, the same 2-second skip over and over, no matter how many times you try to play the song. That's not a metaphor. That's your brain. The neural pathways associated with a repeated story literally get worn deeper with each retelling. The cortisol response that gets triggered when you revisit an old wound actually reinforces the structure around that wound. You are not just remembering your story. Every time you tell it, you are deepening it. You are making it more structural, more load-bearing. McAdams calls this the narrative self. And what he found was that people who build their identity around what he called a contamination sequence. Good thing happened, then something ruined it, and things were never the same. Those people show measurably worse outcomes in health, in relationships, in what he calls generative capacity, which is basically your ability to contribute something meaningful in the second half of your life. And what he also found was that people who tell what he calls a redemption sequence. Hard thing happened, I struggled, and I grew from it. Those people live differently. Not just psychologically, physically differently. Now look, I'm not standing here telling you to pretend bad things didn't happen. My father did leave. That did devastate my mother. That did shape the choices I made. I'm not asking you to rewrite history. I'm asking you to look at who gets to be the author going forward. Because here's the thing no one tells you about finally deciding to rewrite your story at 62. Freedom is terrifying. I mean genuinely, physically terrifying. I remember the first time I sat down to think about what I actually wanted. Not what was stable, not what made sense given where I'd come from, but what I actually wanted. And I felt this rush of something that I can only describe as vertigo. Like the ground had shifted. Because the story I'd been telling had also been protecting me. If the story is that you never had a real chance, then you never really have to try. If the ceiling exists because of where you came from, then you don't have to risk hitting it by reaching. The victim position is uncomfortable, but it's also safe. And giving it up means taking on a different kind of risk entirely. I know a woman named Carol. She was 58 when her second marriage ended. She told me once, over coffee, that she had a whole explanation for why relationships never worked for her. Her first husband was emotionally unavailable. Her second was controlling. And she had a story that connected those two men to her father, to a pattern, to proof that love wasn't something she was wired for. She said it calmly, like she was reading from a document she'd filed years ago. And I remember thinking, she's not in pain. She's in a story about pain. There's a difference. It took Carol almost 2 years to start questioning the document. And what cracked it wasn't therapy, though she was in therapy. It was her daughter, who was 29 and beginning to tell the same story about herself. When Carol heard her own daughter say, "I just don't think I'm the kind of person who gets to be happy in love," she said something inside her went cold. Not sad, cold. Because she recognized the origin of that sentence. She had handed her daughter a story without knowing it. That's the part I need you to hear. The story you keep telling doesn't just live in your head. Your children absorbed it. They watched you choose stability over aliveness for 30 years. They watched you explain away your own suffering with a narrative about where you came from. And now your grandchildren are starting to hear echoes of it. Not because you sat them down and taught it to them, but because children are fluent in the emotional truth of the adults around them. They read us like a language they were born knowing. When my grandson asked me why I always looked sad when we talked about my father, he wasn't asking about my father. He was reading me. He was doing what children do, which is try to understand the grown-ups who are supposed to be the map. And if the map shows a man who is still carrying a 9-year-old's wound at 73, then that's the map he's going to start drawing for himself. I didn't want to hand him that map, so I started doing something that felt almost embarrassingly simple. I started writing. Not journaling, writing. Specifically, I started writing the same events from my life, but with a different question guiding the narrative. Not what happened to me, but what did I do with what happened? Not who failed me, but where did I find unexpected strength? Not what was taken, but what was built in the absence of what was taken. And I am not going to pretend that this was easy or quick. I filled 3 notebooks before anything began to shift. I wrote about my father leaving, and at first I wrote the same story I'd always told. November, packed a bag, gone before morning, ruined everything. But I kept going. And at some point I found myself writing about the specific moment when I was 11, 2 years after he left, when I taught myself to fix a leaky faucet from a library book because we couldn't afford a plumber. I had completely forgotten that. I had forgotten that I was resourceful, that I had found a way. I had edited that part out because it didn't fit the story of a boy who had been abandoned and diminished. And that's what we do. We edit. We are not passive recipients of our memories. We are active curators. And most of us, without realizing it, have been curating a collection that confirms a verdict we reached about ourselves decades ago. This is what reinventing yourself at 60 or 65 or 70 actually means. It's not about picking a new hobby or starting a business, though it might include those things. It is about the much more fundamental act of questioning who the narrator has been and deciding whether you want to keep them in charge. The second chapter of your life, and I believe you have one, regardless of how long you've been telling yourself you don't, that second chapter cannot be written by the same voice that wrote the first one, because that voice was formed under conditions that no longer exist. You are not 9 years old waiting for your father to come home. You are not a 24-year-old choosing safety because the alternative feels reckless. You are not the version of yourself that made compromises out of fear and called them choices. You are someone who has lived, who has accumulated evidence that you don't even know you have because you've been storing it in a drawer labeled irrelevant. Pull that stuff out. Look at it. The times you kept going, the times you chose someone else over yourself and it cost you. The times you almost walked away from something that mattered and didn't. All of that is data. All of that is material for a better story. Personal growth after 50 is not about becoming someone new. It is about finally meeting who you always were underneath the protective narrative. It is about stopping to live in the past, not by denying it, but by refusing to let it be the only source of instruction for who you get to be now. I retired from insurance at 62. I spent the first year feeling genuinely lost, which no one tells you is part of it. If your identity has been built around a story for 3 decades, removing the story doesn't leave you free immediately. It leaves you blank. And blank is uncomfortable in a way that's different from suffering. Suffering is at least familiar. Blank just feels like nothing. And that's its own kind of crisis. But I kept writing, and I started talking to people, and I found something I had dismissed for 30 years as impractical, which was a genuine interest in carpentry. I know, it sounds like a cliché, but I had always made things with my hands when I was young, before stability became the religion of my household, and I had buried it so completely that I had actually forgotten it was mine. I make furniture now. I sell some of it, not enough to matter financially, but enough to matter. Enough to wake up on a Monday and feel something other than dread. That's what emotional healing in retirement actually looks like. Not a revelation, not a transformation, just a slow, deliberate recovering of things you set down too long ago. Last Sunday, that same grandson came in from outside, still smelling like outside, and he found me at the kitchen table with a notebook. He said, "What are you writing, Grandpa?" I told him I was rewriting an old story. He looked at it for a second and said, "Cool, make it a good one." 11 years old, and he already knows something it took me over 50 years to understand. You get to make it a good one. Not because the hard parts didn't happen, but because the hard parts are not the whole story. They never were. If something I said today hit close to home, share this with someone who might need to hear it. And I want to ask you something in the comments. What's one thing you've been telling yourself about why you can't start over that you're finally ready to question? Write it down. Sometimes just naming it out loud is where the rewrite begins. Subscribe if you want to keep having conversations like this one. There are more stories to tell.